So we've used Expression Web to style our page, but what about if you don't use Expression Web? Or what about if you want greater choice or flexibility over things like the colors that you can use or the fonts that you can type in? Because if you remember, they were selected from a limited list. So what I didn't mention in the previous video is that once you create styles on the right hand side here in Expression Web, they're actually added to the code, and they're added to the code at the top. So we said that the difference between HTML and CSS was that HTML creates the structure of the page. So here in the code view we can see we've got the body and we've got heading style 1, heading style 2 and paragraphs. That tells us, tells the browser what goes where and how it's displayed, but the the style information, including things like fonts and colors, which we've created in CSS, appears at the top here. So they're separate. And here it tells us what the body looks like, what H1 looks like. Now, I gave examples of styling a class. So class names begin with a full stop and styling an ID. But actually, I removed these things, so I can delete that information. So one of the benefits of using the code view is that you can tidy these things up. You can also tweak this information. Now, before we go any further, I'll just say this isn't the default format for Expression Web. So as with HTML, how you lay out your CSS is up to you. So I prefer to have all my properties for each type of thing in one row like this, and the semicolon is a separator for the properties. Now lots of people put a semicolon on the end, but because it's a separator rather than a terminator, you don't need one, so it will be equally happy without that there. What the default setting is in Expression Web is to have each of these on a separate line. So it'll look like this. So each one will be on a line. They'll be indented. But if you don't like that, you can change how that happens. So if you go to Tools and Page Editor Options, again, it takes a while on my PC for some reason. There we go. If you go to Code Formatting, you can choose whether you have spaces or lines before and after each element of the style. So you can configure the CSS to appear exactly how you like it. So if you want to style things yourself, and you've found a brand new property that you want to use, and Expression Web doesn't allow you to select it in the section on the right over here, you can just type it in here, and in fact, like Visual Studio, it suggests things that you can do. So it doesn't do it if the semicolon is already there, but if I wanted to add extra properties to the heading, for example, say I wanted to change the font size, if I put a semicolon, we can see then it gives me a list of all the properties that existed at the time Expression Web was made, but you can type in anything that's not in the list if you find it on a site. If you do a search on W3 Schools or Stack Overflow, you can type CSS properties in there. So I can, and if I press an F, for example, it will go down to F, and we can look for font. So you've got things like font size. So if I select font size, it'll then give me some multiple choice options, or I can pick a number. So we'll have a look at sizing in a future video. So I'm not going to do that for now, but that's just to show that you can tweak these yourself. So if you're creating the page and you're not using Expression Web, you can type these things in. You need to define a style section, so you have style, and actually it'll work if you don't put that bit in, but it's probably better if you do, to say what type of style it is, and that the style section ends there. Everything between these two has the selector at the start and then the properties in curly brackets. So you can probably copy and paste those from another example, find a web page that you like, and look at the source code and use that as your starting point. So one of the things I said a minute ago was that editing the code yourself like this also gives you more flexibility over the fonts and things you use. So there's quite a limited choice of fonts, and so I said it's a good idea to select or suggest a selection of alternatives, and what the browser does is it looks through the list to find one that's installed. So if I was to look at this on an Android phone, for example, and it didn't have Arial, it would move on to the next one on the list, and if it didn't have Helvetica, then it would pick a sans serif font. So you can have as many alternatives as you like. So if you have, if you wanted you could add extra fonts at the start, for example, Verdana, or even things like Curls MT. Now, I'm not going to go into this now, but you need to be careful that you pick fonts, or you list a font that will be on any device. If you use a font, so if you are for Curls MT, for example, it would work. So if I go for Curls MT and then Arial, then you can see that it works on this computer because I have that font installed. However, if I was to look at this on my phone, for example, which didn't have that font, it would then default to one of the others. However, if it couldn't find any of those, then it would use the default font, which is usually Times New Roman. What you can do is you can embed a font. So you can include a font as part of your web page. So if you want to use a slightly unusual font, so if you've got like a corporate style and you want to include that font on your web page, you can do that, and you can look that up on Stack Overflow or on the internet if you're particularly interested to do that. So if you want to use a Halloween font for your Halloween party invitation and put that on the web, you can do that sort of thing. Okay, so you can edit the font information, but it's probably more useful for things like changing the colors, because again, you had a limited choice of colors from the drop-down list. So some colors have names, so I've undone the font there, and others have these codes. So the problem with using the names, so common colors, red, easy enough to remember. Now, one of the downsides of the style information being at the top, kind of outside the body, is that when you click down here, it does scroll away from that at the top and I have to keep scrolling back. So things like red, yellow, green, blue, you can describe by name. For other colours, you can use codes, and there are 16 million colours available at your disposal. It's a 24-bit system. There are, in fact, other ways of defining colours. So you can, in CSS, define the amount of red, green and blue as a number, and also the amount of red, green, blue and transparency, or degree of transparency, so the alpha channel. And we'll have a look at transparency in a later video. But what about if you don't want bright red, bright green, bright blue? How can we tell the browser what colour we want? So that's something that, again, that takes a little bit of getting used to if you're new to web pages. Notice also that it's the American spelling of colour without the U, so sometimes that can trip people up. And remember that colour is generally the foreground colour, so that'd be the text colour, and the background colour is obviously the background colour, the background of the page. So I've created a page, and there's a link in the description of the video that helps you work out what these codes are. So here it is. So no, that's my actual page. Here's the page. And so this is how the codes work. They're made up of 6 digits, and they're in 3 pairs. So the first 2 digits are the amount of red, and then the next 2 are the amount of green, and the final 2 are the amount of blue. So we can mix the amount of red, green and blue we want in the colour, and that will give us a greater control over shades, etc. The only thing to remember is that it works like light rather than paint. So if we turn all the colours up, the colour gets brighter. And indeed, so what this page has is sliders for the amount of red, green and blue. So if we turn them all full up, then we can see that it goes white. And if we turn them all down, so we have none of any colour, then it goes black. So the amount of each colour is out of 255, so it goes from 0 to 255, but you might notice that there's only 2 characters representing each colour, and that's because they're represented in a format called hexadecimal. And you don't need to worry too much about that if you use this page or you use some other tool for creating your colour, but if you want to read a bit more about hexadecimal, there's also a link on this page, and it is required for some courses such as GCSE Computer Science, for example. So, if the 3 sliders are at the same level, so there's the same amount of each colour, then what you get is a grey colour. So the higher the values, the paler the grey, because the brighter the light effectively, so it's like mixing light. So we just turn all these down. So obviously if you turn one up, so if you turn red up, it gets progressively redder until the red's fully up, and that's bright red, and obviously the same with green and with blue. And some colours you can kind of work out how to make them. So if you want a purple colour, you want some red and you want some blue, and you can kind of adjust you don't have to have exactly the amount of same amount of each. And if you want it brighter, you just move them both up, and if you want it darker, you just move them both down. But what about the situation where you can't see how to mix a particular colour? So if you're familiar with complementary colours, so if you're familiar with the colour wheel, for example, if you've done that in art, or if you're an old school photographer and you're familiar with printing your own colour prints in the days of film, you might be familiar with this idea. But if we have a look at the colour wheel, then the colour wheel, if you haven't seen that before, basically it's like a rainbow, but it goes all the way around. And colours have complementary colours, like opposites. So, for example, blue is kind of opposite yellow. So they're complementary colours, they're opposites. So one way to do it is to say, well, okay, if I want my page to be more yellow, I need it to be less blue. So I could start off with grey, and as I turn the blue down, the page gets more yellow. So you can use complementary colours to help you mix certain shades that are a little bit more tricky to create. So things like brown things can be a little bit tricky. Or you can go to other sites. So what you can do, and I did this when making a particular site, is you can go to certain pages and they give you suggested palettes of colours that work well together, and they give you the codes for those. Google does a page. They've created something called Material Design, which is their kind of colour palette for Android apps, and they explain how that works and what colours work well together. Also, and there's an exact picture of it here, quite often if you've got a graphics program, such as in this case Paint Shop Pro, you can pick a colour from your colour palette, and it will tell you, as it does at the bottom right here, what the HTML code for that colour is. So quite often you can load up an image, so you've got a logo and you want to include that on your website, and you can pick a colour from your logo and you can match the background colour to a particular aspect of that. So that's quite useful as well. So that's been able to change the colour. So if I wanted to have a pale, let's have a pale, it's not very yellow, is it? But there we go. So I wanted a pale yellow background. All I need to do is copy this value into my web page. So ECEBB2. I need the hash. So ECEEB2. And we've got that colour as our background. So even if you can't name your colour, and there are lots of names, but I always struggle to remember them. So you've got like light grey, medium grey, and all different shades of other colours, but I find it easier just to mix my own colour like that. So if you haven't got Expression Web, or you want more control, if you look at the top of your code, you'll see the style section, and in there we'll have the styles, and you can edit them and tweak them. So sometimes that's quite useful for just tweaking the sizes of things. So rather than going back through the style section on the right hand side, if you just want to make things a couple of pixels wider, you can just tweak the numbers in there. So one of the things we're going to have a look at in a following video is how to size things and all the different units you can use, and you can tweak those in here as well.